It is August 30th, 2017. We're here in Athens, Georgia. My name is Ashton Ellett. This is the two-party Georgia Oral History Series sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. And I'm here talking with Congressman Buddy Darden. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for participating.
Well, thank you, Ashton. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited. It's always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. So let's begin a little bit. Tell us, where you're from, and why does everybody call you Buddy?
Well, I was born in Hancock County, Georgia, not in the county seat, but in the rural area of Hancock County. I was born at home on November 22nd, 1943. My brother John and my sister Georgia still own our family farm, and we have the distinction of owning the house in which we were born and in which our father was born, incidentally. I attended high school at Sparta High, also elementary school in the same location. I graduated from Sparta High School in 1961. I was fourth in my class, but we only had 36 of us, so I wasn't even in the top 10%.
I'm from a small town too, so I can completely relate. So you graduated from Sparta High and came to UGA?
No, I went to North Georgia College for a year.
Okay.
My parents, for some reason, thought I needed some discipline, even though I'd grown up on a dairy farm. So I was there for 1 year.
Okay.
And at the end of that 1 year at North Georgia, I worked at Rock Eagle for the summer at the 4-H club camp. And it was during that summer that I made a lot of contacts in the state 4-H club organization. And at the end of the summer, someone who was supposed to have gone to Washington to be a patronage employee for Senator Richard Russell dropped out. So on about 2 weeks' notice, I went to Washington, D.C. to be a patronage employee for then Senator Richard B. Russell, who was certainly an icon in Georgia politics, a leading figure in Georgia politics. So Mel Wells from Oconee County and I went to Washington and reported on September the 1st, 1962, and began our service. And while I was there in Washington for that year, that was a life-defining experience, incidentally, getting to know so many people. It was an exciting time to be in Washington. I also enrolled part-time at George Washington University and took several courses there as an undergraduate. But during that year at the United States Capitol, where I worked first as an elevator operator and then as a doorkeeper in the United States Senate, I had exposure to what would become the adventure of my lifetime and probably the most defining experience that I had in my early life. I stayed there for a year. This was during the Kennedy administration. And one of my most pleasant memories is going to the State of the Union, going right in on the floor, as so many of the pages and the elevator operators and other patronage employees did with no scrutiny whatsoever. Followed the Senate procession right in, and I shook John F. Kennedy's hand.
Oh.
And I never will forget the surprised look on Senator Russell's face when I went up to him and said hello. Even though he didn't know me that well, I had a really good way of getting to know him because my cousin, William Darden, who served as the chief counsel for the Senate Armed Services Committee and later on was on the Court of Military Appeals with his sponsorship, was Senator Russell's favorite employee. So I had an advantage on most of Senator Russell's patronage employees because he knew me because I was related to his favorite staff member.
Okay. So you and a close friend of yours, President Clinton, can both say, shaking President Kennedy's hand was a formative event in your political life.
It was a formative and defining event, and it's something that I remember, and it's something for which I will always be grateful for having had the experience. But I was there the entire school year, and then I managed to get my Congressman Carl Vinson to get a job for me for the architects of the Capitol over in the House. And so I worked for the following summer as an architect of the Capitol employee in the office filing papers and running errands and whatever they would like me to do. And coincidentally, the other young man that worked with me was the son of Jim Wright, who was a young congressman at the time and who was to become Speaker of the House at the time I was in the Congress.
So how do you get back to Georgia from up in? You sound like you're having a great time up in Washington. Why do you come back?
I was having a great time, but my jobs ran out.
Oh,
and so
fair enough.
I decided to leave, and quite frankly, today is August the 30th, but on August the 28th was the day of the March on Washington.
Yes.
And while so many people stayed for that and participated in that wonderful event, and I was to become John Lewis's close friend and confidant at a later time, still a lot of us went home before the March on Washington because we had been told that there would be riots and the city would be burned down. But in any event, it shows you how the perspectives can change. But that would have been, I believe, 54 years ago when Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech there at the Lincoln Memorial. But in any event, I came home to the University of Georgia, enrolled as an undergrad, and was in undergrad school for a year, took a few extra courses, caught up, and then at the end of my junior year, I entered law school. In those days, you could spend your last year as an undergrad in law school, and you could get a degree after 1 year of successful completion of law school, and then 2 years later, get your law degree, which is what I did. I got my undergraduate degree in 1965 from the university, and also I got my law degree in 1967. That was before I, of course, went to Cobb County.
Sure, sure.
But at the University of Georgia, I was very fortunate. I made a lot of friends in a hurry, and I ended up being president of the student body. I was active in a lot of organizations, and this would serve me well, not only my Russell connections, but my connections I made at the University of Georgia as I got out in later life. Now, candidly, I was not much of a student in law school. I spent too much time being involved in organizations and campus politics and doing things that really some people would say didn't matter. But I had a great time at the University of Georgia, and it led to many lifelong friendships.
Yeah, you wouldn't be the only student body president to go into Georgia politics.
One of my closest friends that I made during my Washington time, and of course I was also a friend of his late son, was the late Jasper Dorsey, who incidentally at one time was the chairman of the Richard B. Russell Foundation and one of the greatest University of Georgia supporters ever. And he took me under his wing and advised me not only in matters affecting the University of Georgia, but also had a lot to do with getting my first job in Cobb County.
Now, how was Jasper Dorsey related to Governor Dorsey?
That would be a very distant relationship. Certainly, at best, it would be obscure.
I wasn't sure if Jasper Dorsey was also related to the James Dorsey who was chairman of the Republican Party.
No, Jasper Dorsey's father was Judge John Tucker Dorsey, who for many years was in the state legislature. He was very closely connected, incidentally, with the Leo Frank matter, which took place in Cobb County a number of years before. At the time of his death, as I recall, he served as the ordinary of Cobb County, which is now known as the judge of the probate court. And in those days, you had a single commissioner, and the county was governed by the single commissioner, and his advisory committee consisted of the clerk of the Superior Court and, of course, the judge of the Court of Ordinaries. So that was how the county was run.
So you relocate, you settle in Cobb County. What took you to Cobb County? Was it work, or was it just that was a growing part of the state?
Well, my relationship with Mr. Dorsey and his many friends in that area, and he was very much plugged into the new county commission chairman, Ernest Barrett, who had just been elected 2 years before that time. He was also affiliated with a crowd called the Young Turks. That was the group that was to take Cobb County to a new level and a new height. And so Mr. Dorsey, through the work of Mr. Wyman Pilcher, Mr. Bill Bullard, Mr. Romeo Hudgens, and others, sponsored me to become the first full-time assistant district attorney in Cobb County. Before that time, all the DAs were part-time except for the district attorney himself. And the district attorney, Ben Smith, was about to be appointed. He had been a part-time assistant DA, and he was about to be appointed by Carl Sanders to take the place of District Attorney Luther Haynes. That would have been in January of 1967. And so I came to work for Ben Smith on April Fool's Day of 1967.
Okay, so Cobb County is absolutely booming at this time. I guess if we could jump ahead a second, just sort of survey how Cobb County grew and changed since you moved there in 1967, and you're still a Marietta resident now.
That's correct. I live right off the Marietta Square, and I've lived within a 2-mile radius all my entire adult life since I got out of law school.
Right.
But at the time, Cobb was not that big a place. It was poised to grow. It was poised to explode. However, the county at that time had less than 200,000 people, and it was all Democratic. All the office holders were Democratic, even though it had shown signs of voting Republican for a few past elections. In fact, Bo Calloway had carried the county in the election of, I believe it was 1966.
Yes, sir.
And Republicans would carry the county later on. I need to point out, and we might discuss this in more detail later on, but lots of times the structure of the political world follows and tags behind the demographics of the county. And Cobb, for all intents and purposes, were already Republican. However, the structure was such that you still had the local offices that were all still Democrats, and you had a strong, viable Democratic Party because the machinery was still in effect. And known Republicans always voted in the Democratic primary because that's where all the action was, where all the decisions were made, and it was very unusual for someone to vote in a Democratic primary. In fact, as I recall, the Republicans did not have a primary in 1966 to nominate Bo Calloway.
By
he was
petition.
nominated at the convention by acclamation. So you see all the action politically at that time and all the structure in Cobb County, and most of the entire state was in the Democratic primary.
So when you moved to Cobb, I believe the congressman from the 7th District was still John W. Davis.
It was John W. Davis, that's right, and he lived in Somerville, Georgia, and Cobb was the largest county in the district, but it was controlled by counties outside the district, including Rome. Rome was probably more powerful than Cobb politically at the time because Cobb would always get split up one way or another, but Floyd always voted together. Chattooga County, where Congressman Davis was, always voted together, as well as the counties ganged up on Cobb, and Cobb was, Paulding County was in the district way back then. Judge James Manning one time and other candidates had run for congressman from Cobb, but they were all unsuccessful because a Cobb County candidate could not win.
Things change.
Things change.
Things do change. So you become the youngest district attorney in the state in 1973?
In 1973, Ben Smith, the district attorney, chose not to seek re-election because after serving for a term and a half, he was going broke. He was a very, very accomplished lawyer, and his salary was only $28,500. The judges made $29,000, and he was at the prime of his ability practicing law. And he had children to send to college and so forth, so he did not qualify for re-election. I ran, and I was a Democratic nominee, and a guy by the name of Richard Still, who had worked in the office as assistant district attorney, had moved on to the U.S. District Attorney's office down in Atlanta as a Republican. He ran against me, and that was the year that I won. I didn't realize how difficult it would be, but I won election by about 2,000 votes countywide. Sam Nunn, running countywide, lost by about 5,000 votes to Fletcher Thompson.
That's right.
And that same year, of course, was the Nixon landslide, but my best recollection is that George Wallace carried Georgia that year.
In 68,
68.
72.
72, let me take that. Yeah, I'm mistaken. In 72, it was Nixon and McGovern, and McGovern was buried by Nixon, especially in Cobb County.
What wasn't much of a contest statewide. It definitely wasn't a contest in Cobb County.
In Cobb County, I remember it was about 3-1.
Oh, yes.
But still, the local Democrats
right.
won. The local Democrats won, and as I said before, Sam Nunn, who won statewide that year for his first term, he lost the county by 5,000 votes. He would never lose it again, of course.
Correct.
But,
right.
That was his initial term.
So you after a period as DA, you go back to private practice as well.
Well, what happened is I like to say that I was the youngest DA ever, and then 4 years later, I was the youngest ex-DA. I lost re-election a year that I should have won. Quite frankly, I should have lost during the McGovern debacle,
right.
and should have won in '76 because Jimmy Carter carried the county overwhelmingly.
Right. Yep.
But the problem was I had some very controversial cases that didn't work out, that later on worked out for me, and I was able to overcome that. But at that time, I had some controversial murder cases that had been overturned in federal court, and I got some bad publicity there. And I lost to a Republican, and I can honestly say I was the last Democratic district attorney for Cobb County.
Really? Okay. Well, that loss didn't scare you away from politics.
No, as a matter of fact, it did. I said, I'm going to go practice law now, so I went into political rehab and practiced law for 4 years, and a legislative seat came up for the western half of the county. And so I ran in a multi-member district on the Democratic, what was then the Democratic part of the county, and I was practically unopposed. I was elected overwhelmingly in 1980. However, that was a year that Senator Herman Talmadge lost the county 71,000 votes to 29,000 votes to Mattingly. So that's when that election was decided. But at the time, Cobb was still essentially Democratic, and we still prevailed because the machinery, Democratic machinery, was still there.
At least in that part of the county, because over on the east side, you had Johnny Isaacson.
Also countywide, there was a bare Democratic majority
because
voting
of Marietta,
because of Marietta, and because of the incumbency of the sheriff, because of the incumbency of the clerk of superior court, and all the county officers that were all quite popular.
Okay.
County commissioners, we had the chairman, Ernest Barrett, was very popular. He ran countywide, and 2 commissioners on one side were Democratic, and 2 commissioners on the other side were Republican.
So you go to the state capitol as a state representative, and then the 7th congressional, the congressman from the 7th district, Larry McDonald, is killed in the KL 007
That's right. I
in
served
83.
one term in the House, Georgia House. I love the Georgia House. What a wonderful opportunity to meet people from around the state and see some direct results of what you do.
Right.
I love Tom Murphy. He was a great speaker, and he brought order and discipline to the House of Representatives, to the legislature in general. And I was reelected quite easily against a Republican opponent in 1982.
Right.
And then it was toward the end of the first year in 1983, September 1st, that Larry McDonald, Congressman McDonald's plane he was riding on and to Seoul, Korea, was shot down over the Kamchatka Peninsula by the then Soviet Union, and he and 267 or 8 other persons perished. And of course, the remains were never found.
Let's talk about Congressman McDonald, a very unique colorful figure in Georgia political history, and I don't know how many people these days know of Larry McDonald. He was a Democrat, but not necessarily in the mold of what we would think of as Democrats.
Well, you heard of rhinos, and they're always talking about that. I guess he was a Dino. He was a Democrat in name only. He was, at the time of his death, the national chairman of the John Birch Society. He had the most conservative voting record in Congress. He considered himself a strict constitutionalist, but there was a certain charisma about him, and a certain way that he appealed to the electorate. Now, one-on-one, he was not particularly friendly or particularly impressive, but he had that ability to hit the right political note among folks in Cobb County, conservative folks in Cobb County, and especially going all the way up to the Tennessee line. And in fact, he had just been reelected about 60-40 over a guy named Dave Sellers, the Republican, in 1982 as a result of a successful reapportionment that included all of Cobb, Bartow County and Cartersville, Floyd County, Chattooga County, Somerville, Dade, Walker, and Catoosa counties. So the district at that time reached all the way from the Chattahoochee River to the Chattanooga city limits. And that is the district in which I ran in a special election along with 18 other people to a nonpartisan special election, which Governor Joe Frank Harris called very, very quickly. Everybody assumed that Ms. McDonald was going to take his place, and that had been the way that it's always happened. And since then, that's the way it's always happened. But ours was the exception for a couple of reasons. I'll tell you in a minute.
But right, so it's a special election because you can't appoint to the House of Representatives.
Right. Qualifying closed on September the 15th. After
so 2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. Then the special election was held in mid-October. And 3 weeks later was a runoff. I was able to get in a runoff with Ms. McDonald. She got 30%. I got 27.5%. The previous Republican nominee, Dave Sellers, got 25%. And then the other, 15 or so candidates, 16 candidates, all shared what was left, all in single digits, and some less than 1%. So the people sorted through it pretty well. But by that time, Cobb had begun to emerge, and so I carried Cobb County. I came in number one in Cobb County, and I carried only Cobb County plus one precinct in Bartow County, and that was enough to put me in a runoff. My home precinct had as many votes in it as Dade County did, for example. And so this is the time that Cobb finally reared its head and decided they were going to elect their own congressman. And I had most of the Democratic machinery in Cobb, and there was Democratic machinery still left in Cobb, as well a lot of independent voters too, as well as the Democratic machinery throughout the rest of the district, which was all Democratic at that time.
What I find surprising is that Mr. Sellers, who is sort of a known quantity, he had run before, was only able to get 25% in Cobb County in 1983. Cobb, as you said, Cobb County was instrumental in Senator Mattingly's election. But so, what's the difference?
The difference is it was a special election, and only people turned out who vote in primaries and special elections. Whereas the time that Senator Mattingly was elected, that was the first Reagan year. And while Senator Mattingly and President Reagan carried Cobb, of course, President Carter carried the rest of the state, but they both carried Cobb overwhelmingly, and he rode the Republican coattails led by President Reagan. In fact, my congressional district was the only district that was carried by President Reagan in let me get my dates right, 1980.
Okay.
The general election of 1980.
So you go on to have a long career up in Washington.
Well, some call it long, some call it short. But I had, I think, a very rewarding, very satisfying career. I served a partial term from November 7, 1983 until the beginning of my first full term, which began in January of '85. Then I was re-elected 5 different times. So I served in effect 6 terms, 5 and a partial term.
And what was the competition like for re-election?
I didn't have much competition,
Right.
just to be candid with you.
Sure.
Because I would split the vote in Cobb. Even I would carry Cobb. I wouldn't carry it overwhelmingly. But then I'd carry counties that were predominantly Democratic, like Bartow.
Okay.
In my best years, like '86 and '88, around there, I'd carry those counties in the 80s, 80%,
Wow.
84%. Chattooga County, I remember carrying it, 85%. All of those counties, once I got to know those people and they got to know me, we fit real well. I was conservative on fiscal issues.
Okay.
And moderate on social issues. In fact, some people call me an outright liberal on social issues. If I may digress just
Sure,
a second.
absolutely.
When I was in the state legislature in my second term, the ERA came up, Equal Rights Amendment. And that was a big, big wedge issue. And everyone was scared of it. And I never will forget, I thought about it a lot, and I was a lawyer. I had a daughter who was, I think, in about the 4th or 5th grade at the time. And so of the entire Cobb delegation, only 2 people, A.L. Burris, and I, voted for the Equal Rights Amendment. It lost 153 to 40-something in the Georgia legislature, but I was told that would be the end of my political career. But it turned out to be something that set me apart from everybody else.
Okay.
And so most of the Democratic activists in the area and a lot of the disparate groups came together and supported me, probably because I voted for the Equal Rights Amendment. It was something that defined me that nobody else had any definition. So I was able to step out apart from the crowd. And
Right. I mean, the ERA, very interesting because it split the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to a degree in the state. You know but your yes vote puts you in the same column as people like State Senator Coverdell and Mike Egan and Kill Townsend.
I might also add too, I think you'll find this interesting, that my colleague in the House, Johnny Isaacson, voted against it, and my colleague in the Senate, Roy Barnes, voted against it. They just thought that it was going to be the death knell of them politically, but it turned out to be an advantage because most people didn't care, but the people who were for it really cared.
Right.
Made a difference.
Right.
And people came out of the woodwork to support me, and I probably, I've thought about this, but some people might disagree, but I think it was probably the most single strongest factor in my favor toward getting elected to Congress that in that special election that set me apart.
From the other 17 or 18.
From the other 17 or 18.
So you don't face too strong or potent opposition.
Well, my
from
first
people.
re-elect, I was very disappointed because a airline pilot named Bill Bronson, who went around the country running against incumbent congressmen he thought were vulnerable, moved to Cobb County and ran against me. And he didn't carry Cobb County, but he almost did. That was in the Reagan re-elect.
Right.
And so I only got about 55% of the vote, maybe 57% of my first re-elect, and that was disturbing to me. But that was a year, '84 was a year that all the county offices turned over.
Yeah.
And it took 20 years to do it, but the machinery finally was caught up by the demographics. Cobb had essentially been Republican, or at least independent, for years and years and years, but it took until 1984 for the county to become solidly Republican.
So we work our way up into the 90s, and Republicans, expand their control or at least strength in Cobb County. The state, 3 Republican congressmen are elected in 1992.
That's correct, as a result of the redistricting.
Right.
I believe it been Congressman Kingston, Congressman Linder, and they defeated an incumbent congressman. Both Linder and Kingston were new, but Congressman Mac Collins defeated Congressman Richard Ray.
Right.
That was a very scary thing for all of us.
Did you have competition in 92?
Fortunately for me, I had no competition in the primary, and then I had what some people would call a token opponent in 92. Speaker Murphy helped clear the deck for me, because since he had decided he wanted me to be his congressman and moved me by that time over to practically a new district. As a result of that, I had no Democratic opponent, and I had a Republican who qualified, really who was of no great significance.
Things are different by 1994.
Right. Well,
what
in
happens in
1992, I had what I consider to be a token. I wasn't too concerned about 94 because I had a lot of goodwill built up, but at the same time, President Clinton had been reelected, and for the first time in my political career as a congressman, I had a president of the same party.
That's right.
In the past, it was a lot easier because I could say I agree with the president when I think he's right, and I voted against him when I think he's wrong, and I could steer a middle course. But it became a lot more difficult for 2 reasons once President Clinton came in. 2, I'd reached the point of seniority in the Congress where I was on the Appropriations Committee, and not only was I on the Appropriations Committee, I was on the Defense Appropriations Committee.
Very important for Cobb County.
If anybody ever watched the movie Charlie Wilson's War,
yes.
I was sitting right there with Charlie Wilson and John Murtha and others, and it was arguably the most influential committee in Congress, or at least as far as the defense of the country is concerned. It was quite an experience and quite an opportunity. So, but when I was able to do things for the state, and when I was able to get a lot of things done for other districts as well by being a member of the Appropriations Committee, at the same time, I had to be a part of the majority, and I couldn't, in my opinion, go off and on solo anymore. I had to be. I was part of the team.
Sure.
And if you're going to be part of the team, you've got to vote to a great degree with the team. I don't mean in terms of giving up your principles or whatever, but as you know, one person's politics is another person's principle. But to me, it was mainly political. But I even times that probably it might have been a little more personally advantageous to me. I went along with, and I think properly so, with the Clinton economic plan, and I supported the House leadership on not every matter, but most matters that came up, because I'd become part of leadership, and if you're going to be part of the team, you've got to take a bullet for the team every now and then. The only problem, there are too many bullets out there, plus the fact in '94 that we had the so-called check scandal, which turned out to be nothing for people like me at the time, but it got a lot out of attention. And at the same time, I was running in a virtually new district. So when you take the Clinton unpopularity at the time, and he was quite unpopular at the end of the first 2 years. He came back strong, but he did have some serious political problems there in the beginning, getting started. You take that, you take the some tough votes we had to cast. Brady bill came up. You make enemies on either side on that. We had the assault weapon from the crime bill. We had, of course, the Clinton economic plan, the tax bill, which we in effect raised taxes on certain parts of the population, only 1,500 in my district, but everybody thought they were getting a big tax increase. So it, for lack of a better word, invited opposition. Now, I had two opponents in the Republican primary surfaced. One was Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald, who was a physician and gynecologist down in Carrollton. And as you know, she's recently been appointed head of the CDC.
Right.
Very distinguished position. And the other was former U.S. Attorney and Reagan appointee named Bob Barr. I considered Dr. Fitzgerald to be the much stronger of the candidate because she's a woman. She had a better way with people and was generally better liked.
Okay.
And was considered to be a better fit for the district. Anyway, in the Republican primary, Congressman Barr prevailed over her. And I didn't think that I would have a free ride by any stretch of imagination. I felt like that he was by far the weaker of the two candidates in a general election. But it turned out, of course, I lost the general election, but I think I probably lost it more had Dr. Fitzgerald prevailed.
Do you think that Congressman Barr was able to win that primary because of the name recognition he had built up running for Senate?
Not really. Barr is a pretty good political name. If his name had been Levinsky maybe or something like that, but he had a good political name. I think the reason he won was quite simple. It was the unpopularity of the president and his agenda, which I supported and make no apology for doing so.
Sure.
I don't. Looking back on it, I might have voted differently a couple of times, but I still think the votes I cast were the right and proper ones.
So you go into practice with law, back into a law practice, but you try to make a comeback.
Tried to make a comeback in 2002. What had happened? A very extraordinary thing happened. Speaker Murphy was, I think, and Governor Barnes were in at the time, and they redid the district. Speaker Murphy was against my running, by the way, and really put me out of my old district, but because he favored a guy named Roger Kahn with whom he had formed a relationship, and I ran in a Democratic primary and was not successful. It was a fairly close Democratic primary, but the district was meant to be tilted to the Democrats. In fact, so much so that Congressman Barr decided to move over and run in the new 7th against Congressman Linder.
Right.
So you had the two of them running against each other in a district based in Gwinnett County, reaching over to Bartow. So, and as you know, Congressman Linder prevailed.
Right.
But then, to most people's surprise, Roger Kahn lost in the general to Congressman Gingrich. Roger Kahn was a very poor candidate. Not a bad guy, but he just did not fit the district. He was a Buckhead spirits dealer and very wealthy, spent a whole lot of money. I spent a whole lot of money, a lot more money than I should have, looking back on it. But anyway, I lost, but he was not, frankly, he was a terrible candidate. And this, I don't know what it says about me, but in any event, he was a terrible candidate in the general election and lost a race that any other Democrat probably could have won.
Right. So, and you've been in political remission ever since.
That's correct. That's correct. I've been. That's a good way of putting it. But I've continued to be active. I've given more money than I should to different candidates, and I would call myself politically active, and I've sworn off politics up until just recently when my friend and a young woman that I've been very involved in mentoring, Stacey Evans, has decided to run for governor. So I'm chair of her campaign, but the chair does not really mean I've got anything to do with the day-to-day operation of the game. I'm just trying to help round up my friends to help her out.
Right, and we'll talk about Stacey Evans' campaign and Stacey Abrams' campaign a little bit. But what I want to do is go ahead and zoom out a little bit to talk about sort of what we've already sort of touched on superficially, but the changing demographics, the changing the shape and the way politics has worked in Georgia that has allowed the Republican Party to sort of rise from insignificance in most places in the state to a place where they were competitive to now they're the distinct potent majority in this state, statewide, congressionally, what have you.
This
what
might
gave
surprise.
rise? Yeah.
This might surprise you, but in 1980, the most Republican county in the state was DeKalb County.
Yep.
And several years before, it had a wonderful Democratic congressman named James A. Mackey, who only served one term. But he voted against what people said would be the end of the medical care as we know it, and voted for what some people termed the communistic Medicare. And he cast that courageous vote for Medicare because he thought it was the right thing. The doctors all ganged up on him.
Oh, yeah.
And beat him with a guy named Ben Blackburn, who had been the president of either a Lions Club or a Kiwanis Club somewhere in the county. And then later on, DeKalb became a predominantly Republican county. And of course, we all know that day that it's the most Democratic county in Georgia. Well, the same thing is happening, in my opinion, to a lesser degree in Cobb.
Okay.
Cobb County is not the center of the Republican universe anymore.
Not anymore.
As it likes to claim that it is, and the numbers of straight Republican voters are diminishing with every election. I'm sure you're aware that in this last election, Secretary Clinton carried the Cobb County
to the shock of many.
To the shock of many by more than 5,000 votes. And I've looked at the numbers, and the numbers are not just among so-called thinking people in East Cobb. The numbers are in the South and in the West, where significant, and in the city of Marietta, where significant numbers of minority populations now reside. And in fact, if we Democrats in Cobb, and Roy Barnes and I have kicked ourselves about this, but if we had known that our county commission chairman, Tim Lee, was in trouble, we would have run our own Democrat, and I think we would have prevailed and elected a county commission chairman this past time. And I think you'll see a much, much larger number of contested races in Cobb beginning in 2018 and in 2020, a presidential year, because Cobb County is, I think by 20 will be at least purple, if not blue.
So it seems like everybody I talk to hangs the hope or their prognostication on political change on demographics, whether it's in Cobb County or statewide, that the demographics of the state are going to change the politics of the state. Would you agree with that?
I don't think demographics alone can do it.
Okay.
I think the Democrats have got to get a better organized and more coherent message.
Okay.
And so that it's not just a matter of demographics, that is minority and African American voters, Latino, Hispanic, and so forth. It's got to be a coherent message that can also bring younger white voters into the party as well. We've got to rethink, and right now we're going through some pretty serious growing pains in the state. I'm not sure where we'll end. I think things might have to get worse before they get better. I don't know, but at the same time, the average voter in the suburbs now is not a Republican voter. It's an independent voter, and in many instances leaning Democratic. But the Democratic Party in Georgia is not doing well enough to get a clear and coherent message. At the same time, and I've got to give them credit, the Republicans in Georgia, by use of the machinery, they've made us Democrats look like sheer and pure amateurs. They have maximized their advantage in the state legislature. They've maximized their advantage in the congressional districts. they maximize their advantage in local elections, even in nonpartisan elections. They have done a lot better job than we have as Democrats. And at the same time, the Farm Club of the Democrat, our bench is, we have a very, very thin bench, and they have a very large bench. So it's not going to be easy for the state to turn back either purple or to turn blue, because Republicans have done such a great job of maximizing their advantage. Incidentally, I think it's worth noting that we have never elected a governor in the state of Georgia since Reconstruction who was not a Democratic office holder first.
That's
right. Sonny
That's right.
Perdue was a Democratic state senator turned Republican. And I've got a great picture of Governor Deal and me and Cynthia McKinney, former Congresswoman McKinney, on Air Force One with Bill Clinton coming back to Georgia. So, Governor Deal, of course, has Democratic credentials as well.
Sure. So, I guess the question would be is, the Republicans have all the statewide elected posts. Let's see, 11 of the, or 10.
10 of the 14.
10 of the 14 congressmen.
House, both United States Senate seats.
2/3 of the legislature and the governor's mansion.
Right.
What is the greatest danger to the Republican majority? What would imperil Republicans in this state right now?
What always does. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as you well know, it's quite a job of keeping, as they say, all the animals on the circus tent. And there's a certain group in the Republican Party which continues to want to drive it to the right, to the right, to the right.
Okay.
And we're seeing this alt-right groups. We're seeing some of these fringe groups now who feel somewhat emboldened, especially as a result of what I believe is the Trump election. And we're seeing the pendulum swing too far to the right. And as most of the people in this country, in my opinion, consider themselves centrist. And most of the people in this country want government to work. And most of the people in this country believe that there's a necessary and proper role for government. Today, here we are on August 30, 2017, the city of Houston, Texas, has been devastated by floods. Who do we look to? We look to the federal government, we look to FEMA. And nobody wants the government involved until they have a problem. And nobody wants the federal government involved until their Social Security check has a problem, or their Medicare is not properly reimbursed. And everybody seems to be always against the government until it affects them. And so some of the hardcore type folks, I think we saw that come to light, did we not, in the recent vote in the United States House and the United States Senate, when they attempted to repeal Obamacare outright and cast millions of people out of Medicaid who would have no other access to medical care in this country. And we've evolved to this point in the country that we believe that government does have a role. There are some things that the government can do, and there are some things that private industry ought to do, and there are some things in which there ought to be a partnership. And so I think our country, just like the state of Georgia, is going through a redefining of its roles.
Well, we're talking about the changing and evolving role, but some would say at least the Republican leadership in this state is, in terms of policy, not too different from some of the past Democratic governors, like Joe Frank Harris or George Busbee, in terms of economic growth and sort of that aspect of the role of government and things like that. Do you see that divide within the Georgia Republican Party?
Oh yes. What I'm seeing though is that the Republican leadership so far, Governor Deal I think has done a very outstanding job of keeping everybody under the tent, as I'd say. For example, he put aside this so-called religious liberty bill, which he knew would be a disaster in Georgia for the business community. Just this week, the statue of Martin Luther King was placed
I'm glad you brought that
at the state capitol. And interestingly enough, it almost replaces a statue of Tom Watson, who was reputedly the founder of the KKK and also incited the lynching of Leo Frank.
That's correct.
He didn't do it alone by any means, but I think that's significant. So Governor Deal, based on his Democratic origins, has some moderate streak in him, and so does Senator Isaacson, even though he appears to be reluctant to put it into action. But in any event, the leadership, especially of the two top Republicans in the state, has seemed to realize that you don't go overboard. That there's a point at which you say, we've gone far enough here, now we need to come back to the middle.
And what about the Democratic Party, your party? You know, are there noticeable divisions that you can see?
Oh yes, of course.
Sure.
And right now, we also are trying to avoid being defined by race. And the majority of the voters in the Democratic primary this coming year, in 2018, will be African American. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you have some very good, strong white candidates running, and our party is going to have to learn to sort it out by issues. But it's not that easy, because the African Americans have been driven for many years into voting so much as a bloc. It's hard and very difficult for an African American to take a public position in favor of a white candidate over an African American candidate, regardless of qualifications. I remember Congressman Lewis back when President Obama first announced his candidacy. And in fact, President Obama even came down for Congressman Lewis one of his birthday parties, a great celebration. Mm-hmm. But he endorsed Secretary Clinton, and got a lot of flack for it. And in fact, not one of his proudest moments, but he ended up reversing himself, because President Obama carried the state somewhat, at least his district, overwhelmingly. Mm-hmm. So as a result of that, part of leadership is seeing where the parade's going and getting out in front of it. And so this time, Congressman Lewis did not endorse the white candidate. He endorsed the African American candidate. And sure, this race is a constant consideration that we've all got to learn to address maturely and objectively. But it's hard. Sure. It's hard, and that's the most serious problem we as Democrats have now, is how to sort through the issues of race.
Do you think the racial polarization of the electorate has hurt Democrats statewide in Georgia, or in districts, that the perception of the party?
Not only does it affect the party, it affects the population in general. Mm-hmm. It affects how we look at each other and how we feel when we get up and start the day. And as you know, I think it goes without saying that the last 2 years, the last year of the Obama administration, certainly the first year of the Trump administration, have been remarkable in terms of the polarization that has been brought about. Some of it justifiably on the circumstances. In fact, some of it very regrettably and totally undeservedly. So, of course, this is playing out, and of course, it's the elephant in the room that we all sometimes fail to acknowledge, but it's there. It's a problem. It's a big problem for the Democrats. Not a problem for the Republicans, because the Republicans are becoming older and whiter, and in my opinion, even less tolerant. And so it's essentially, I'll be honest with you, I think it's a Democratic problem more than a Republican problem, because Republicans appear to have staked out the older, white, conservative voters. And I don't see how they can continue in the long run. To do it. But at the same time, in Georgia, they've done such a masterful job that the machinery that they've established would take a long time for new demographics, whether it's all Democrats or minority voters or what, to dismantle.
So we have a very divided electorate, parties divided racially, ethnically. What are the issues that Republicans and Democrats in Georgia, at least, can work together on or seem to be able to agree on, if there are any in this day and age?
Well, first, economic growth and development. I think we're there. I think continued, and in fact, the state has been very proactive in transportation and infrastructure, and they've taken a lot of these issues away from the state Democrats that the national Republicans are faltering quite a bit on. And so most people, including me, are not totally against what the Republicans have accomplished. They've been somewhat fiscally responsible. We Democrats, I think we ought to coalesce around public education. I think that's been the one great failure of the Republicans in this state, in my opinion. So that is one area. Another area is in the area of health care. I think that health care in this state, I think Governor Deal had to do it all over again. He would have permitted Medicaid expansion. Now, he'll never admit it. And he'll go to his grave saying otherwise, and I understand that. But we have foregone over $12 to $14 billion of Medicaid reimbursements that would have come to the state, and imagine the economic impact that it could have had. Look at our hospitals that are failing throughout the rural areas in particular. And somebody said we're only going to end up with 4 hospitals in the state before it's over. That, of course, that's an exaggeration, but at the same time, the health care is another thing. Another factor is individual rights and freedoms. I think that while everybody's for law enforcement, I think that in many instances, I think the statutes of Georgia and the empowerment of the law enforcement has gone too far.
Really?
And I think that needs to balance back. And in particular, I think mandatory sentencing is really, and Governor Deal's been trying to get out from under some of those things.
I was just going to ask you about
I give him credit, but it's kind of hard to get the legislature to reduce the penalty on a particular crime, but you've got to give the courts the flexibility, in my opinion, to do this. And the accountability courts, by the way, that he has fostered a kind of, for lack of a better word, a way of circumventing some of these laws that have gone into effect. So I think as far as the Democrats go, I think there's an agenda out there and things we can do, but at the same time, Republicans so far have outmaneuvered us.
You've mentioned rural health care, especially south of the fall line, south of Macon, Columbus, Augusta. Back in the 1980s, when you were first elected, was the origins of the big two Georgias controversy, that there are two Georgias, one rich, one poor, one rural, one urban, suburban. Do you think that's still true?
I think it's gotten worse. I think it's gotten worse. There's a guy named Doug Bachtel who died a couple of years
Yep.
ago. But he was a great source of information about so many things that you wouldn't think of. I remember being with him down at the Carroll County Farm Bureau back when I was in Congress. So this would have been prior to 1995, when he told the members of the Farm Bureau, to their shock and dismay, that there were more private security guards in the state of Georgia than there were farmers. And because farmers somehow think that they have a disproportionate influence on the election. They don't. And they haven't had for a long time. And the Farm Bureau, bless its soul, my dad's former president of the Farm Bureau in Hancock County and the Sparta chapter, but Farm Bureau is essentially an insurance company now. And they take issues on certain political matters that affect farmers, but that's about it. That's about it. It's not the behemoth, it was in Georgia politics at one time. But having said all this, is that they're not two Georgias, they're probably 3 or 4 Georgias.
Okay. And
the reason it's getting worse, in my opinion, is the lack of delivery of health care and public education. And one thing the Republicans have done, in my opinion, is they've continued to, they call it choice, they call it freedom and so forth, but the money has come out of public education in favor of private schools and private academies and homeschooling, and that to me has been a very, very sad development. And that's probably the main area of disagreement and disappointment I have with Governor Deal. I think he's done a good job on many other areas, but he was a child of public school teachers, and so I've been a little disappointed there. And of course, money is always a problem where health care is concerned. But I feel like the state, if not the federal government, is not going to do it, then the state ought to step in, have regional clinics. So many things can be done that nobody should die of appendicitis anymore, or some of these things that can be cured by proper medical attention.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else other than public education, rural health care, that can revitalize the rural Georgia and small town Georgia?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, as you know, everybody wants a plant. Everybody wants a factory, and in fact, you've got a few counties just begging for prisons, and that. In southern Illinois, by the way, I remember that was a big issue.
You read my mind.
At one time, they put together a video one time and lobbied for a prison there.
The Marion Supermax prison in
my
home county.
So anyway, I think a wise placing of state facilities and state funds in order to maximize. Of course, you're not going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen pedigree. We all know that. And Senator Weiss Fowler, when he was running for his initial term, pointed out that the rural Georgia export its most valuable product, and that is the young people coming on. And I'm not trying to put myself in that category necessarily. I didn't have a hometown to go back to, essentially. They already had a lawyer, and nothing going on, a population of less than 10,000 people, no industry, no way to make a living. And so these places keep digging themselves deeper and deeper into substandard conditions.
I guess we can hop back into electoral politics. 2014. A lot of statewide Democrats, pinned a lot of hope on legacy candidates. State Senator Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn, obviously the grandson of a president and the daughter of our esteemed former senator. What happened in that race? Because that was a real blow to state Democrats.
It was, and in fact, it's all about turnout. If we had had the same turnout in statewide we had in 2 years later in the presidential race, I have no doubt, and I think the numbers show that in all likelihood that those two candidates would have been elected. And I was very disappointed, of course, in the lack of turnout and the numbers just weren't there.
Right.
And the Republicans turned out their numbers. We didn't turn ours out.
Speaking of turnout, we already touched briefly on 2016, but I think if most political observers on election night saw the numbers roll in from showing Secretary Clinton winning Cobb County, winning Gwinnett County, would assume that Hillary Clinton was going to carry this state, but that wasn't the case.
Right.
Why not? Is it again just turnout? Is it the fact that she only was able to carry 20% of the white vote?
I would say all of the above. Plus, after 30 years of being in the limelight, she's been a punching bag for everybody who had something negative to say about her husband, about the country, about every issue. She has been, and I quite candidly did not think that she would run this last time.
Really?
And that shows you how little I know.
No.
And because I felt like that she just picked up too much baggage.
Right.
And people want something new. They want, and which I think is an advantage that the Democrats at some point are going to have in Georgia, because I think at some point the people are going to say, I'm ready for a change. I'm ready for something different. And things aren't any better in Appling County, or things aren't even better in Georgetown County or Brooks County than they were before the Republicans took over. And again, and I hate to, it troubles me to say this, but a lot of it is based on race too. And that's, but it's just going to take a while for it to sort out, in my view.
We talk about voters wanting something new. Do you think that helped explain 2002, the 2002 election for governor, with Governor Barnes losing re-election, and also Senator Cleveland losing re-election? Do you think that was just the state had elected Democrats for so long that the electorate was ready for a change? Or do you think it was something else? There were other issues at play.
I think there was other issues. I think, of course, Governor Barnes had a few problems that were self-inflicted, a few unforced errors. Of course, the flag, in my opinion, was not the sole issue. It maybe would have been a contributor. I think trying to move the education community too far, too fast. He had all the school people against him, and so, in all fairness to Governor Barnes, I think he made some decisions that needed to be made and should have been made. However, they could have been made a little more tactfully and a little more collaboratively.
Okay.
Governor Barnes and I are close friends, and but he is not as collaborative or process-oriented as he ought to be sometimes. He gets to the bottom line. He's smart, he's quick, and I think the way he went about some of these decisions, he could have brought a lot more people along with him. So some of his problems were unforced errors. Another thing that you've got to consider is that we just gone through 9/11, and President Bush had passed that test, and I think he probably passed it with flying colors. Incidentally, my daughter who was with CNN at the time, was with him down at Sarasota when he was in the classroom reading. She was a producer for CNN, and she and her boss John King were in the room recording what took place. And shortly before they all took off to a secure location out at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and John and the cameraman got a chance to go, and she and the rest of the White House press corps were stuck in Sarasota for 2 days because they couldn't fly out.
I didn't know they left the press corps on the ground.
They took a couple of cameras.
Yeah.
Cameras. What do you call the group when you
the pool?
The pool. Right. They took a couple of pool cameras, and that was it. And then left everybody else there.
Well, I guess there are worse places to be stranded than Sarasota,
right.
but still, the point is made.
Right.
So it's, we just had these issues that you're talking about, the flag.
Mm-hmm.
15 years ago, I guess it's been since 2002, but those issues are still coming back up.
Well, not 15 years ago, but some years ago, Governor Miller got all pious and upstaged everybody about it, and then all of a sudden he tucked tail and run in his own words. But Governor Barnes is a different breed, and once he says he's going to do something, he's going to try to do it. And looking back on it, it was maybe something that he didn't have to do everything the first term.
Right.
And
right.
He tackled two big problems: education and the flag, and succeeded with his goals. Of course, what happened is once Governor Perdue came in, he reversed both of them. But that's a story for another day, I guess.
Right. So.
And Senator Cleland, let's talk about him,
sure.
him briefly. That was essentially a Republican year too. And
2002 was a big wave.
And Senator Cleland kind of got swept up in some of that as well. I think that's one of the things that this state is going to regret over the years is the way they treated Senator Max Cleland, because here's someone who had given not only his whole life to dedicating public service, but also 3 of his limbs, and served with honor in the state senate. Let me tell you a little something about Senator Cleland.
Yes,
I don't
please.
think I've
Please do.
ever said this, but 1965, I came back at the end of my first year in law school to be an intern again, a White House intern, but I was assigned to one of the agencies. I spent all my time over at Senator Russell's office because I knew everybody there. Plus, I had gotten a bunch of my buddies' jobs over there, run the elevator and things like that. And so they had a group of college students Senator Russell organized. I helped to organize, and in the Armed Services Committee room one afternoon. And Senator Cleland, who was working for Congressman Mackey, came. And Senator Cleland, I'm 6'1", he would have been at least 6'2", tall, strapping guy. He just graduated from Stetson University. And he was all enthusiastic about he had just gotten his commission and was going into the Army. And of course, that was before his accident.
Right.
And most people think of him as a little short guy because he's always been in a wheelchair. But he was a tall, strapping, manly guy. And I remember a lot of good conversations we had at that time. But that was then, of course, he went to Vietnam, and all the rest is history. Another thing I didn't tell you, going back a little bit, 1963, that summer, I had several roommates. One was Hamilton Jordan, who ran the elevator for Russell. Another one was Tommy Malone, who has become probably one of the leading trial lawyers in the state.
Right.
Another one was late Felton Jenkins, who served on the Board of Regents and was a lawyer with King and Spalding. Another was Jim McIntyre, who became Burt Lance's #1 guy in OMB and briefly was head of OMB. Another was Proctor Jones, who was, if you looked at the Russell archives, you'll know that he was the senator's next to longest employee the whole time, and at the time of his retirement was the senior most staff member in the United States Senate.
Wow.
Senator Russell had him on the personal staff, then moved him over to the Appropriations Committee staff.
Take it to go back to Senator Cleland for a moment. Do you think he sort of suffered a backlash because when voters elected him in 1996, they were expecting another Sam Nunn and Senator Cleland wasn't on those issues as moderate to conservative as Senator Nunn had been. Do you think that contributed to his ouster?
No, I don't. I think
Okay.
I think it was a little different political climate. One, of course, Senator Nunn had been at the time of his retirement there 24 years and had a settled constituency, and Republicans were afraid to challenge him, and he had reached out to them, and in fact he was virtually unbeatable. Sam Nunn could have been elected 1, 2 more terms with no problem, but he chose to retire, and Senator Cleland was never able to, because of the growing, in my opinion, the growing Republican Party in Georgia. I think that was a big factor in that. As a result of all that, he never had the luxury of having an uncontested race like Sam Nunn did, essentially in 1978 and in 19.
I don't believe he was ever seriously contested.
No, he never had a
once he was in
had a serious race. But I think the Republican Party had emerged too, and they'd never have been able to knock off Sam Nunn, but they saw Max as vulnerable.
Sure.
And was able to do it. So I would, in my opinion, I don't think it's a particular vote he cast. I think he looked after his business very well. I think the people, again, I would attribute to more of a philosophical Republican Party in its growth.
We've recently had
and a good candidate, of course.
Oh, sure.
Against him.
Right. Well, let's take a look at then Congressman Chambliss and State Senator Perdue, 2 Republican candidates from what had been the heartland of the Democratic Party in Georgia, at least at the state level.
Right.
How much of that was, when you're talking about the emergence of the Republican Party, breaking out of those suburbs and bringing in rural conservative, if generally whites? How much of that as sort of a geographic expansion of the party mattered?
I think geographic still matters.
Yeah.
Because when I was running, and up until the time I think that probably Senator Perdue was elected, geography mattered, and I thought we'd gotten beyond that with Senator Isaacson from Cobb County, Governor Barnes from Cobb County, but people still take a lot of pride in their hometown and as also you mentioned 2 Georgias. There's also a 3rd Georgia that's pretty much anti-Atlanta, because even though Atlanta now metropolitan area is right at 4.5 million people, still there's some resentment. And a lot of people in Atlanta don't consider themselves Atlanta.
Sure.
For example, I'm in Cobb County. You go to Scotland, somebody says, "Where you from?" From Atlanta. And so there's a lot of resentment out in the other areas of people who feel like they're under-recognized. My friend Neely Young, I'm sure you're probably familiar with Neely. He's just sold Georgia Trend to the Morris organization, which just sold it again to another operation. But Neely has carved out a niche of being able to go into these small towns, writing about them, writing about what they do, their important things, doing a big article on them, and selling them 4 or 5 pages of ads at the same time. And it's been a great thing, because people like recognition, not like to read about themselves, and they get a little tired of somebody always being from Atlanta
Sure.
and so forth. So I'm not sure how much it played an issue in those races, but that's another factor that's sitting out there, in my opinion.
Right. And we just had a very high-profile, expensive special election right in your neck of the woods. Well, just outside your neck of the woods.
Well, not really, because when I originally went to Congress, I represented about 40% of that district.
Okay. Okay. So
The Cobb County portion of the now 6th district was in my district.
So it's it's been redrawn at least twice since you were in Congress now.
Well, 3 times actually. They did a
That's right, the mid decade. So the John Ossoff Karen Handel special. I guess it was John Ossoff versus the field before the runoff. But let's get your assessment of that race. John Ossoff comes out of nowhere to put together the most successful Democratic campaign in the 6th congressional, far more successful than any Democrat probably should be in that district. What's your assessment of that race and sort of its maybe long-term significance?
Well, as usual, it's a combination of factors. He was able to run with unlimited money, almost too much money. It became really just outrageous, the amount of money that both candidates spent. Especially when you consider I spent $180,000 on my first, $108,000 on my first campaign. However, all the checks that were in the mail after I won got there. So I ended up maybe with 140, 150, something like that. But first of all, the amounts of money spent by both sides is obscene in my view. But backing off just for a second, a lot of it was anti-Trump. A lot of it was anti-Trump. People seeing what have we done, who have we elected, do we really want this? So that was part of it. And a lot of people who really never paid much attention to politics before in that area became energized and excited about it. And I've met with John Ossoff a couple of times since the race. He's a very personable guy, only 30 years old. And I think they were probably effectively used that living just outside the district to beat him over the head quite a bit. But at the same time, the difference between my race and a runoff when I came in second, and he came in first, he got 48% the first time. And if it'd been a short period window like I had of 3 weeks, he would have won. But with 2 months, that gave the Handel forces a chance to spend the equal amount of money, and also, like I say, to bring in the cavalry. And that district is a Republican district.
Right.
And it was created as a Republican district. It was created for Newt Gingrich. And it was held first by Newt. Then Johnny Isakson represented it when Newt resigned. Then, of course, Tom Price then succeeded Johnny when Johnny went to the Senate. And now, of course, Karen Handel is a congresswoman from the area. But he made a good run at it and should have won, but he didn't. But I still think he ran a great race.
Do you think
the expectations got too high?
Expectations were very high.
I was part of a group that was unsuccessfully tried to keep the expectations down. But once the media gets onto it, once all that enormous amount of money starts feeding frenzy, then I think if he could have had a shorter period of time, he could have won.
I want to ask a process question rather than some maybe a historical question. You talked about the amount of money. I think the last figure I remember seeing was something around $30 million that the Ossoff campaign. At what point is there a law of diminishing returns?
I think they clearly reached it. But let me point out that while Ossoff spent large amounts of money, if you calibrated the amount of money spent from independent groups, which I'm totally against, and all these other groups that come in, so-called public interest groups, you'll find out that they both spent about the same amount of money.
Okay.
Once you add up the citizens for carrying guns and the folks, the pro-life folks, and all of these independent expenditures, the PACs, the Koch brothers, you add them all up, it's going. Last time I checked, it was about the same.
Okay.
And she didn't raise the amount of individual donations he did by him. But when you look at what they spent, and the president himself coming down here, and all that kind of thing, over and over and over again. Vice president, and I mean, there's no end to it, no end to the amount of money that was spent.
Do you think the Democrats will have? Do you think that district and then maybe what's now the 7th district, Congressman Woodall's district? Do you think those will be very competitive, as long as Donald Trump is in office?
I think they will become more competitive as time goes, especially with if the president continues to shoot himself in the foot.
Okay, so looking ahead to 2018, we've talked briefly about Representative Evans, who you chair her campaign.
I would point out that I'm all in. I'm totally for her. My role as chair, frankly, is more an honorific role than it is a day-to-day.
Full disclosure.
Yeah. So.
But Stacey Abrams on the other side of the Democratic. What's her story? What would be her appeal as to the Democratic electorate? But also, what could she offer the state of Georgia?
Well, she has, I think, a certain capability. Stacey Abrams, you're talking about.
Correct. I apologize. Yes.
I think, in my view, she probably doesn't have the life experience and the understanding of the state and what it's about. This is not a personal criticism of her, but I think Stacey Evans appeals to a much wider, broader constituency. I'm sure in the last few months you've read J.D. Evans' book.
Oh yes.
And by the way, I had a chance to go to Atlanta History Center and see him, and I read the book too. But Stacey Evans, I think, can appeal to just a wider group of voters that can identify with Stacey Evans. So far, and I hope it does change, and I don't say this in any way to criticize her, but so far her campaign has been defined solely by race, and I think that while that might pay short-term dividends, I think it will pay long-term. By the way, the book I was talking about is Hillbilly Elegy.
Right.
And is it J.D. Evans? Is that
J.D. Vance.
See, I'm thinking about Stacey.
But you had Stacey, yeah?
I'm thinking about Stacey, but J.D. Vance, who incidentally, you probably saw this, but his spouse is a very outstanding attorney, and she's going to be a clerk for the Chief Justice.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, she's going to be a clerk in the U.S. Supreme Court for the Chief Justice of the United States. That's pretty.
Very prestigious.
That's pretty.
That's
impressive.
Right. Absolutely.
And they've had a child since then.
Sure. So whomever gets out of the Democratic primary, Stacey Evans or Stacey Abrams, is going to have to face a pretty potent Republican challenge. It's going to be an open seat.
Right.
Governor Deal's retiring after a long political career. Right. Let's size up the Republican field.
Okay.
Who do you see as the front runner?
Well, you've got to say right now that the front runner is Lieutenant Governor Cagle.
Right.
And he passed up an opportunity 8 years ago. In fact, Governor Deal running was kind of an afterthought.
Yeah.
He didn't come in until the folks in Gainesville saw that Casey Cagle, Lieutenant Governor Cagle, was not going to run, and then all of a sudden, that's when he bolted in. Turned out to be a very good decision. Most people thought it was foolhardy at the time. But in any event, Cagle's the man to beat.
Right.
Then followed closely, of course, by the Secretary of State, and who's people like, but doesn't have the exposure and doesn't have the funding that Cagle has. But he does have good connections, and That's one thing that Brian has that every politician needs to have.
And this is Brian Kemp.
Brian Kemp is luck. He's kind of at the right place at the right time, and he's kind of second but holding on. So that's the guy that sometimes can surprise people. But then you've got all the hard right is not satisfied with either one of them.
Right.
They like Senator Hunter Hill. And as a young man that grew up in Cobb County, I noticed just decided to run the other day, who's a Navy SEAL named Clay Tippins. And I've known him and his family forever. And I was just shocked that he's back in Georgia, wants to run for governor. Then you've got some other folks whose names I can't call right now.
Right. Well, I think there's only one, Senator Williams, Mike Williams.
Right.
And so, do you think with 4 or 5 candidates, do you think there will be a runoff, or do you think it's a little early? Obviously,
the problem: the more you put in, the greater your chance for a runoff, and especially Republicans, because you've got the more ideologically. I'm sorry about that. The more ideologically oriented Republicans, in the same way with Democrats, are vote in disproportionately high numbers. And so I've been seeing these straw polls and so forth, and they've been putting Hunter Hill way in front at some of these various caucuses, around the county, these little clubs. So who knows where it's going there? And need I tell you that 30 days is an eternity in politics.
Yes, especially these days, the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, I go back to 1998. Mike Bowers was going to be not just elected, but anointed and crowned as governor. It was not going to even be a race. Pierre Howard, the lieutenant governor, was going to run, but he didn't have the enthusiasm that Mike Bowers had. All right, we all know what happened to Mike Bowers. Then along comes Pierre Howard. Roy Barnes had even pulled out of the race and was running for lieutenant governor. And to everybody's shock and surprise, Pierre Howard announces, hey, I've decided not to run. So Roy Barnes then jumps back out of the lieutenant governor's race, back into the governor's race. And then, of course, defeated Lewis Massey handily, and then of course Guy Milner, who was back at it again. He had lost
thrice run.
Right, he had lost the Senate. To Max Cleland after beating Johnny Isaacson in the primary. That's still another
interesting dynamic in that primary with the social issues and cultural issues.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, Barnes elected governor, and looks like he's just a shoo-in to be reelected in 4 years. But
were you surprised when Governor Barnes, when the votes came in? And
everybody who says that they were not surprised is not being forthcoming with you. Of course, I was surprised.
Sure.
And some of Purdue's strongest. It's been said that the second most surprised person that he lost was Roy Barnes, and the most surprised person that he lost was Senator Purdue himself. He had no idea. He'll say he did all. You know how that goes.
Sure. So it's. You mentioned the bench, the farm club for the Democratic Party, virtually non-existent.
Right.
But if you can dredge up names, who do you think represents the future of this party, or do we even know at this point?
We don't know, but I'll throw out a few names.
Sure.
Mayor Reed, I think is somewhere in the hunt. State Representative David Dreyer is in the hunt. Mayor Teresa Tomlinson from Columbus is out there. Several political folks over in Richmond County. Of course, we talked about Stacey Evans and Stacey Abrams,
Right,
of course.
right.
There are some real activists running for Public Service Commission this year, whose names I can't call now, but they'll be servicing. I think you'll see Plant Vogel come up as an issue in the Public Service Commission at the general election. And I'm not as well versed on that issue at all to comment on it, but I think it'll be out there. I'm trying. Oh, of course, Representative Scott Holcomb.
Right.
He's been out there quite a bit, and is well regarded, and nobody jumps out at me right
Oh,
now.
sure. All right, we were trying to think of the name of the new House Minority Leader, Bob Trammell.
Bob Trammell from Luthersville, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
That's right on the edge of Meriwether County, just inside Coweta County. And he's an impressive young man. He was a student here at the University of Georgia, outstanding student, and he was a presidential scholar, and then went on the University of Georgia and got his, University of Virginia, and got his law degree.
So, what do you think? His election will help the Democrats in what had been traditionally Democratic areas, but have since the 1980s and 1990s sort of slipped away. When you think of Meriwether County and Coweta County, those aren't exactly, it's not downtown Atlanta or something like that.
He's a centrist,
mm-hmm.
and most of the county offices now in Coweta County, which is Newnan,
mm-hmm.
are Republican. However, there's still a lot of Democrats down there, but they're more independents. I think the more than party in this state, you've got a lot of independents, mm-hmm. and most people I think the number of independents is more than the number of Republicans or Democrats. I think most people don't tend to identify themselves with parties anymore.
So if we're looking ahead and we're thinking, what do politics in Georgia look like 10, 20 years down the road?
Gosh, Ashton, I wish I could make that prediction. Of course, I'll be gone by that time.
Oh, well,
probably,
I don't know about that.
And will not be in a position to say, but I don't think there's any doubt that Georgia will become a two-party competitive state.
Right.
With our population, with the growth, with the differences of opinion, and with a great diversity in this state. By diversity, I'm not just talking about black and white.
Right,
I'm talking about diversity of ideas. I'm talking about diversity of political philosophy. And Georgia's become a melting pot to a great extent. People are coming. I see people in my home county of Cobb now from everywhere. You wouldn't imagine, whether it's from Somalia to Southern Illinois. So mm-hmm. I think our state will be a two-party system, and I think it will matter in national elections. As you know, we're what, 9th, 10th, something like that in
9th, I believe.
In terms of population and growing and
Absolutely.
growing and prospering. And in my view, you'll see a lot of political turnover.
Well, is there anything else you want to share with us, or anything you think we left out?
Gosh, we've left out a whole lot.
Oh,
and
sure.
There are many things I'd like to share, but I will make one observation very briefly, is that my next birthday on November 22nd, mm-hmm. I will be 74 years old. On my 20th birthday, I had just returned to the University of Georgia, and that was the day on which President Kennedy was assassinated.
Yes, sir.
And the whole world stopped. Everybody remembers where they were, what they were doing, and like some younger people might remember 9/11.
Sure.
But two things from that period of time I want to recall just briefly. First is the death of Richard B. Russell, after whom our library and facility here is named. Richard Russell died in January of 1971. He was 73 years old, had been since November the 2nd of the previous year. So at this time, here's someone who always thought as a young man that Senator Russell was a very old man, and toward almost in his dotage. I am several months older than Senator Richard B. Russell was when he died. I was talking to Sam Nunn's wife, Colleen, at her 80th birthday party recently down in St. Simon's, and I told her that Sam Nunn was a lot older than Richard B. Russell was when he died, and I had a hard time making her believe me, because it's all in perspective now.
Right.
One other quick observation is that he died, as I recall, on around the 21st of January. Had he died 2 weeks earlier, or maybe a week earlier even, his successor to the Senate, who turned out to be David Gambrell, named by President Carter, would have been named by former Governor Lester Maddox. And how different that might have been.
Might have been Lester Maddox appointing Senator Maddox.
It could have been, or a young executive secretary named Zell Miller.
Zell Miller.
Or Tommy Irvin.
Right.
Who went on to become the...
Sure, he was agriculture commissioner when I moved here in 2008.
So yeah. I guess the most amazing thing of politics is the unpredictability of it, which is why I've always ascribed to what Yogi Berra said about predictions. He says people should avoid predictions, especially about the future.
Well, I think on that note, we're gonna wrap it up here. On behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library, thank you, Congressman Darden, for participating in our two-party Georgia oral history program. I really do appreciate it.
All right.